And welcome to another chat. This one's going to return to a familiar topic, narco submarines. A new narco submarine has been discovered in Colombia by the Colombian forces, and it's quite significant. I think this is a new type of narco submarine that we're going to see a lot more of. There it is there. It looks not that special in this photograph. It's quite small, as you can see. The big deal is that what's missing? The crew. This is an uncrewed narco submarine, and the magic ingredient to make it work like that is, of course, Starlink. So I'm H.I. Sutton. I'm an independent defense analyst. I cover unconventional naval warfare, um, including narco submarine technologies. I've had less time to devote to that topic in recent years for obvious reasons, but this is new and significant. I want to just do a quick video. There's also a lot of AI, fake imagery, and things like that out there. So I just want to put some better quality info out there. This is unscripted, unedited. Let's get on with it. So this is significant, and even though there's only one instance of it, I think it is going to be the trend we're going to see. Partly this is confirmation bias. Maybe I've been predicting this for years, as I'm sure other people have as well. But if we look at narco submarines since about 2010 time, 2007, when they first started appearing, certain things remain the same. Some of the narco submarines we see today look very much like the ones we saw in 2010, but there are all the same certain trends. And the recent ones right now are that the transatlantic route is becoming much more prominent. Most narco submarines are still in the Pacific, sailing from Colombia up to Mexico, but we are seeing more and more incidents in the Atlantic. Also, there's a new path across the Pacific. Whether it goes all the way to Australia or whether the narco subs rendezvous with another vessel halfway, not so sure. It's a really long way, but they're sailing towards Australia as well. We've also seen an uptick in disguised narco submarines. This is something that probably happens more often, but unless you catch them red-handed, you wouldn't know. In order to make them less um, obvious when sailing down rivers and in fishing villages, things like that, before they start their voyage, they disguise them as something akin to a fishing vessel, putting a fake superstructure like this white box or shed on top of the narco sub here. That again is not new, but it is definitely an uptick. And the last one is the uncrewed vessels. As I say, only one's been found, but I think we're going to see more. So it's not literally the first uncrewed narco submarine. We call them USVs in defense terms, uncrewed service vessel. But in terms of narco ones, there was something called a sort of self-propelled torpedo. This is similar to the narco torpedoes that are attached to ships or towed behind ships, except that you put it in the water, start the motor, and it sails itself to shore. So it's very, very short range. It's not for making the whole voyage on its own. It's the sort of thing that you launch from a fishing vessel to take the narcotics from that vessel to the shore. And a variation of that is the narco surfboard. This example found in June 2015 in the Mexico-US border. A surfboard stuffed with drugs and given some form of power, typically is going to be electric motors. Slightly larger, but in the Adriatic, so between Albania and Italy, we found at least one uh, remote control boat. This is a punt, which is a general term for a small boat in that region, and it's been made so that it's autonomous. Also in the Mediterranean, um, into 2022, a particularly interesting narco submarine operation was raided. Various things were found, including some contraptions like this, which are essentially self-propelled snorkel subs. Very, very small, electric power underneath. Um, really interesting design, actually, but again, quite small. And also in the Mediterranean, much more recently, last year, a kayak was found, essentially a seagoing kayak that's been made into an uncrewed vessel with two electric motors. Really interesting design. Actually, here's my illustrations of those designs. Of course, I do illustrations in MS Paint, as you probably know. But let's talk about the new one. Firstly, an interesting observation. It looks more cigar shaped than typical narco submarines. It is rounder. It's got sort of um, the upper hull has a chine running along it. I don't want to say stealthy, but it's somewhat angled. It's actually very reminiscent of the first narco subs, particularly the type called Bigfoot. This was literally one of the first ones discovered. That's why it was called Bigfoot, because rumors of their existence predated their discovery. Um, and you can see that that's got sort of a similar hull shape. I don't think that there's any direct relation. These are, you know, approaching 20 years apart. So I don't think it's the same person building them, but it's just interesting that it looks more like that. Possibly with the shift to uncrewed, they'll find that the hull form evolves differently to the crewed submarines that we see. Here's my illustration of it. First pass, I haven't seen detailed photographs and I haven't seen it below the waterline, but we can make some inferences from what is visible. Firstly, there's two air intakes pipes. This is pretty normal. They stand quite tall, suggesting that it's going to run a little bit lower in the water when fully laden than some other narco subs. Possibly below that is where the engine is logically. The air intakes are largely for the engine, so it's going to be there. Whether it's one engine or two, I'm not so sure. Probably drives directly all the way through the vessel to the propeller at the back. Also, the exhaust system seems to vent quite far aft as well, so it's running along inside the hull. You might be tempted to think that the motor might be further aft, but if that's the case, it's not clear why the air intakes are where they are. In terms of cargo, it's carries about 1.5 tons of cargo. Um, it's basically 1,500 um, of the bricks of cocaine, and it's it suggests from the imagery that these are two small cargo bays, one fore, one aft. This is not a huge amount. It's typical of narco submarines. I think the amount, as I've talked about before, some narco submarines can carry much more. Sometimes media exaggerates it. 1.5 tons is a lot of cocaine and more than worth it. How much cocaine these vessels carry is less about what's possible and more about what's optimal. Okay, let's look at the routes. This is a map coincidentally posted today or very recently by the US Coast Guard showing the main routes from Latin America to Americas. There's also the Atlantic route and the Trans-Pacific route, which aren't marked here. Oh, firstly, you've got to make a small correction for our international people. Um, so the main route for narco subs is in the Pacific. That's the left of this image. From Colombia and Ecuador, going up to the region, southern Mexico, El Salvador, that sort of area, either directly along the coast or sailing south and going round Galapagos. The Caribbean is more normally associated with go fast vessels. This one is a really high performance go fast vessel, but you do get what we sometimes call go slow vessels, more like fishing boats. But it's not really where you find narco subs. A lot of the very earliest ones were here, and there are examples continuing, but in general, it's unusual to find narco or less common to find narco subs in the Caribbean versus the Pacific. So that's interesting. It was found in the Caribbean. So what? What do we make of all this? The first thing is that being uncrewed removes the risk of the crew being captured and reduces the intelligence gathered from an interdicted vessel because the crew can't be interrogated and so on. It also allows the smugglers to monitor progress. The two-way communications, they can see where it is. That actually gives some new possibilities. They can do much smarter mission planning, and they're not restricted by the human endurance. Being inside a narco sub sailing across the Atlantic, for example, is several weeks of ordeal. The uncrewed vessel can do it without complaining. It can be smaller. I don't think it will necessarily be more stealthy, Narco-subs are already very stealthy in reality, but it will be smaller and it won't complain for lack of food and sunlight. Downside from a narco smuggler's perspective, it's like to be less reliable in the sense that if the engines break, and they tend to, then there's no crew there to fix them. Also, it might be more susceptible to being pirated. I'm not entirely convinced. I think I needed to write this, but I'm not entirely convinced it's the case because I think that very few narco subs are pirated. And when they are, it's like to be by people involved in the same smuggling. The main deterrence against people stealing these is not just a crew, it's who they belong to. So yes, it might happen. Yes, it might be slightly more easy to do when there's no one on board to resist or have to deal with, but it's probably not a huge risk. There are other faults, lots of faults what law enforcement can do to adapt to this, but I don't think that's the right video for that. Okay, thank you ever so much. Please like, subscribe. I will keep a weather eye on narco developments, but I'm mainly focused in Europe, Black Sea. Thanks.